There has long been a debate as to whether or not it is okay to lift weights with your back slightly rounded. Some people believe that if you lift in this position, you are now much more likely to get injured, and that in some cases this is the specific reason as to why someone now has a back injury. I think this mostly has to do with their preparation for moving into that position. Depending on your level of training and your level of strength, your back has a certain tolerance for movement and lifting weight. When you exceed that tolerance, that is when you become injured. It's not because the position itself is inherently dangerous. It's because the weight you're trying to move and the way you're trying to move it has exceeded your ability to tolerate that. I believe this is something that we cannot afford to ignore as we're training and moving in everyday life, because we have to move into spinal flexion every single day. When you tie your shoes, unless you have the most flexible hamstrings on earth, you have to round your low back. When you're picking up your child off the floor, you likely have to round your low back. There are always positions where we have to move into spinal flexion, and our back allows this position because it's a necessary motion. Now, what we have to do with that is we have to train our body to control and stabilize in a flexed spine. Moving into spinal flexion when lifting weights is entirely context specific. So on one end of the spectrum, if we have someone who is maxing out on a deadlift versus on the other end of the spectrum, you have someone who's lifting a light weight from the floor, the degree of spinal flexion that should be allowed differs significantly from scenario to scenario. When we're trying to lift maximum weight, you want a rigid and neutral spine, not only because this places less shear force on the discs and the low back, but it allows you to better transfer force from your feet up into your arms as you're moving that weight, which is necessary when moving the heavy weight, because otherwise you are now less efficient and it's much more difficult to move. Whereas in the other example, because you are moving a much lighter weight, the stress on the back is much lower, meaning that you can safely move through a little bit of spinal flexion while still moving the weight and training the muscles in that position. What this comes down to is when we're lifting very heavy weight, you are much more likely to fatigue the muscles of the low back and the core. When this happens, this is when the low back will round, and then you have additional stress placed on the discs and the ligaments, all the passive structures that are designed to support the spine. Whereas when you have a much lighter weight, your fatigue will come much later, meaning that you can safely move in and out of that position for many repetitions without an increased risk of injury. Of course, this all has to do with your baseline level of training. If you have never moved or you don't consistently move into spinal flexion with a load, you have to start very light. A good option for this is with a simple medicine ball lift from the ground up over the shoulder. So what you're doing here is you have to bend down, flex the spine to reach the ball as you lift it up over the shoulder. Now, obviously here I'm using a kettlebell, which is a little bit heavier than a medicine ball, but again, it's all dependent on how strong you are. Other options for this would be lifting a sandbag up from the ground. You could do lightweight deadlifts or Romanian deadlifts with a little bit of spinal flexion. Again, emphasis here on lightweight because you have to build up your tolerance to that position over time. Nothing near your maximum because that's just unnecessary and you're asking for problems. With that said, a rounded back is a normal movement that your body is designed to do, and it is often necessary when lifting things from the floor. All we have to do is train intelligently so that you can build up your tolerance to that position over time, and then hopefully avoid a back injury someday.